to the Polgar Chess University. The topic of this lesson will be about exchanging pieces and simplification combinations. I bet you know that when one side is ahead in material, that is, has a material advantage, usually is eager to exchange pieces, including queens. Also, when you are being attacked, typically you're looking for ways to trade pieces, especially queens. Let me quote a little bit from the famous visionary Aaron Nimzowitsch. This is what he said about exchanging, when you should and shouldn't exchange. On one hand, you should look to exchange to seize a file without loss of time. So, for example, to open a file. Another reason to exchange pieces may be, I'm of course talking about other than winning material or reaching a checkmate combination. This is more from the strategical perspective. A second one he mentioned, to destroy a defender. So for example, if one piece defends another piece, you may want to trade off one of, let's say, your bishops for a knight, if the opponent's knight was defending, let's say, the opponent's rook. So therefore, again, you would gain material. Another reason to exchange would be not to lose time retreating, that is, to gain time. Okay, let's get started with some specific examples to demonstrate some of the things I just mentioned. And then also, of course, we'll see some simplification combinations. In this position that we see on the board, white has two extra pawns on c3 and d4. Therefore, it's clear that white's doing well. And it should also be clear that it's not to black's advantage to oppose the white rook on the open file and initiate the exchange of rooks. Nevertheless, black's position is quite miserable and not enviable, but nevertheless, the more pieces that are on the board, the better counter chances black would have to get counterplay, or the more ways for white to go wrong. Let's go on and see some positions when one side is having a heavy attack. Like in this position, white has nicely doubled up, has a battery on the G file between the queen and the rook. In fact, immediately threatening to checkmate with queen to G7. In this case, the natural defending move, retreating the queen to f6, wouldn't be the greatest because it would drop the knight in the center. In similar situations, what you need to remember is that if you can get rid of the queens, the white attack dies. So therefore, you should look out for opportunities as such to force the exchange of queens. Check, and regardless whether the white king moves out of the check or white captures, black achieves his goal. And now let's see some simplification combinations. The position on the board, at the moment there is even material. But here, white has an opportunity, after some trades, winning material. And the correct sequence is trade knights first, attacking black's rook, and when bishop takes back, trade bishops. Now, black is in major trouble because after king takes bishop, white is ready to fork. In the next example, there is material balance even though both sides have different kind of pieces. But if you add up the extra bishop and knight on the black side versus white's extra pawn and rook, you'll see the balance. Black's real problem here is, or rather challenge is, the fact that the king is on c7, and that by no means is safe, as long as white has strong attacking pieces such as a queen and a rook. Also, in addition, black's pawn on b4 is under attack right now. Yet, black has an elegant way not only to trade queens, after which the black king's position is no longer a problem, but also to gain a pawn at the same go. Try to figure out what black's move is. And yes, it is. Beautifully moving to the corner, sacrificing the queen, and forcing the white king into a fork. And now black captures a pawn and then captures the queen, and luckily also protecting that b4 pawn at the same go. What a nice combination. Also, it's important that if white would now play rook to b3 attacking the knight doesn't need to leave its current position, which is guarding the pawn on b4, but can simply rather move the bishop to a6, protecting the knight. And the rest is matter of technique, as they say. The bishop will come to c4, and then the b pawn will be ready to advance. The next position is from a recent game from the 2008 Chess Olympiad. In this position, it's quite obvious that white has a very active position and black is purely on the defense. But one of the challenges that we have, that after we accumulate strategical advantages, we have a nice position, the moment will come when we will need to transform the strategical advantage to material advantage. And it's very easy to miss those moments. Therefore, I recommend at all times you look out for tactical opportunities, see if something works. Here white has a beautiful sequence of moves that basically forces black to resign within 5 moves. Try to sit back and figure out what should white do to win the quickest way. And the answer to this puzzle is rook captures bishop, rook captures back, and now white captures the pawn, again leaving black only one single choice. And after all these trades, here comes the important moment, not allowing black time to simply walk to g6 and then capturing the pawn on g5. It's time to push the pawn and create a passed pawn that will be unstoppable. A very nice simplification combination. And now let's see an elder game that was played back in 1957. In this game between Trifunovic and Zita, it was white's turn. Looks like kind of a normal position where the fight is over the c-file and generally on the queen side. But it seems that black has a pretty solid position, defended the c6 pawn more than enough times, even after a potential disappearance of white's knight from c3. Yet, white has a very nice sequence of moves that leads to winning a pawn. Try to figure out what should be white's correct move in this position. As so often, I always suggest first look for the forceful moves. And here the solution is sacrificing the knight on d5. So after pawn takes, white can have a big change on c7, changing all 4 rooks. And then the queen is ready to come down to e8 with a check, and exchanging the bishop for the knight as well, and finally picking up the bishop in the corner, leaving white with an extra pawn. And by the way, targeting the pawn on e4 as well. And let's see now a famous game between former world champion Vasily Smyslov and one of the all-time greatest American players, Samuel Rashevsky. In this position, we can see that white has a clear lead in development. White has developed all his pieces, activated all the pieces, while black still has 2 pieces sleeping, as I like to say. But this is one of those situations that white's advantage may be temporary. If white doesn't play aggressively, forcefully in this position, black will get the time to develop his knight to c6 or d7, and then the rook will be also ready to come out, and at least we can look ahead of a long game, even though black would still remain with a long-term weakness on d6, a backward pawn. Nevertheless, black would be certainly still in the game. But in this position, white used a couple of trades to transform his strategical advantage to material advantage. And this is what Smyslov did. The first step was to trade the bishop for a knight, which generally speaking is not a good idea. Typically, we prefer not to exchange a bishop for a knight. But in this case, it's all based on a concrete calculation, and white ending up with material gain at the end of the day. Of course, if the queen captures, white would simply exchange the queens as well and then grab the free pawn on d6. Therefore, black had no choice but to recapture with the pawn. And now white initiated a second trade, the trade of the queens. Even though white is offering the trade and then to ruin the pawn structure after queen takes, pawn takes, but black will lose quickly a couple of pawns in the center. Black for a moment tried to keep the queens on the board, but white was persistent and continued with a check on d8. Now black cannot avoid the loss of material. Traded the queens and developed the knight to d7, attacking white's bishop, but the bishop simply retreats to c7. We can see black cannot avoid losing the material. Let's see a few more moves, how the game continued. Knight c5 and rook captured on d6. Now if black takes the pawn on e4, they will just end up losing the pawn on e6. And continued with rook c8, attacking the bishop. Bishop b6. Knight a4. And white continued grabbing pawns on e6 and on e5. Came knight to c4. And now, of course, white needs to protect the bishop, which he can and did. Knight captured bishop. And white ended up being 2 pawns up and won the game. A very nice example of when you would want to exchange pieces. And now I'd like to share with you a couple of examples from the King's Indian type of positions. Let's start with this one, where the game started like this. Typical King's Indian defense moves. And white chose the Zamish variation. Black continued with e5. And continued d5. Knight retreats to prepare f7, f5. And here, white normally would play queen d2 as a best choice. But what happens if white continues with knight e2, a natural developing move? Here is a typical idea when, based on the pawn structure, we can see that the bishop on g7 is kind of being buried behind the pawn on e5. So therefore, in such situations, black would want one of two things to happen. Either to try to move ahead that pawn from e5, but that seems quite hard to accomplish in this position, with having white a nice chain of pawns right here on f5, e4, and d5. Or the second, more realistic in this particular position, to try to exchange the dark squared bishops. And that's what black did. Black can play bishop h6, temporarily sacrificing the bishop, but black right away, of course, wins the bishop back after the check, and g3, queen takes. So now what we'll see is, based on the pawn structure, that while the dark squared bishops are gone, there are only light squared bishops. And we can see that how many white pawns are there on light squares, and most of them are not likely to be able to move away from those squares, especially the one on d5 and d4, and therefore we would consider this position black having a good bishop versus white's bad bishop, because potentially black can attack those pawns while the white bishop is greatly restricted in movement by those pawns. At the same time, the black pawns on d6 and e5 are completely safe because white has no dark squared bishop and therefore cannot target them easily. The next position will be rather similar in pawn structure, but with reversed colors. If you would imagine the white pieces being painted black and the black ones white, you'll notice the great similarity between the two positions. This game was played by former world champion Boris Spassky. And here his opponent, Savon, with white, made a not very good move by pushing the pawn to f5. And here the big question is, what should black do? Should black retreat his bishop? Or should black exchange the bishop for a knight? Well, this is what Spassky did in this position. Continued by trading the bishop for a knight, which I have to add that in closed type of positions, in positions when there are no open files or diagonals, is typically a good thing to do, because knights in only those type of positions are more valuable usually than bishops. So on one hand, it was a good trade from that perspective, but even more importantly, black can immediately follow up by activating the dark squared bishop that was meant to be a bad bishop, and to trade it off for the white dark squared bishop. White continued by playing rook f2, and black happily traded the bishops. Now we can see how inactive the white bishop on g2 is, while the black knights are flexible to maneuver to better and better positions. Let's see how Spassky converted his positional advantage to a win. The beauty is that Black has all the time in the world to prepare the improvement of his pieces. For example, this move clears the c8 square for the knight to move to c8 and then to d6. White at the same time does not have any active plan or target. And Spassky continued by playing queen c7. The great thing about such positions is also that, as I said, there is plenty of time. So even if Black makes a few not most straightforward moves, usually nothing happens because there's not much that White can do. Black's position is totally secure. And finally, knight c8 appeared. White is playing g4. I'm not sure if this helps White or Black actually. So may have been better not to do that. And the knight moved to d6. d6 is a great square for the knight because it targets the c4 and e4 pawns. Came rook g2 and queen f7. Obviously, eventually the battleground will be the g file, so both sides are preparing for that. In the meantime, Black just attacked White's pawn on c4, which White defended with the queen, and Black was the first one to initiate the opening of some files on the king side. White captured, Black captured, creating a discovery attack on the knight on h4. Knight retreated and came g5. Now we can quite see the f4 square being rather weak. So if Black would get a knight there, that would be a great accomplishment. And as we'll see, that's what Black is working on diligently in the next series of moves. Came rook f2 with a cheapo threat of capturing the pawn on g5. Black, of course, can easily defend against that, just move the queen out of the pin and at the same time attack the pawn on g4. White retreated the knight to defend the pawn on g4, and Black played rook h6, which is a multi-purpose move. On one hand, puts a defender on the pawn on f6, also at the same go clears the h8 square for a second rook to double up. White played b3. That's a wise move. I probably would have done it a while ago, not wasting the energy of my queen to defend that pawn on c4. And came queen e7 to clear the e6 square for the Black knight. As we'll see, it will need it very shortly. Knight d3, attacking the pawn on c5, and knight e8. It's not just a defensive move, defending the pawn on c5, but also starting the maneuver to go to g7 and e6, and finally to f4. White played bishop g2, knight c7, or g7, didn't matter much, I believe. Rook e1, and finally the knight arrived. Rook f5. Doesn't really help the situation because now even the white rook may get trapped. Rook h8, attacking the pawn on h2, provoking another weakening, h3, and knight b4. A very good idea to first trade off a pair of knights so the other knight can really just sit in real comfortably on f4. Came rook doubling, knight takes, queen takes, and here we go, knight f4. Now we can see the h3 pawn is about to fall, so White is in serious trouble. Of course, sacrificing the rook for the knight doesn't really help either. Black won relatively quickly after this. The game continued with king f2, queen c7, the queen trying to come in to White's territory through the queen side. White can temporarily delay that. King rook g8, king e2, rook g5, trading the rooks. King f3. White can delay black making progress, but ultimately cannot stop it. Queen's traded, even though the position is very closed. Black will be able to break through by, very important move, sacrificing the pawn to make sure the black king will have an entry point on d4. And then after bishop captured, king c7, bishop f1, and king d6, White resigned as the black king is unstoppable in its road to enter into White's territory. A very nice game by Boris Spassky. And finally, our jewel of the week. Here we go. Look at this position. It seems like White's position is quite hopeless. Black having a queen, and White only has a bishop, knight, and 2 pawns. But the knights are on the same file, kind of skewered up, and also the pawn on h5 is under attack, as well as the one on a3. So White seems to be in full of trouble. Reality is, it's White to move and win. Try to solve the position yourself before you listen to the correct solution. The brilliant move is putting the bishop on b5. Imagine 3 different pieces can capture it. Wow, why would White do that? Well, let's see the main variation. If queen captures, White at least has a fork, winning the queen back. And then the pawn on the h file is unstoppable, because after knight d6, that almost catches it. If White would continue pushing the pawn, indeed it would, by knight f7, but now White has a cute trick, deflecting the knight by sacrificing on c4, and then after knight takes knight and h7, indeed White promotes the pawn and wins. But let's go back to our starting position and see what would happen after bishop b5 if Black captures the bishop with a king or knight. Well, the king capturing is easy, just knight d6 fork. But how about the knight capturing the bishop? This is a beauty. This is amazing. Now, White would play knight c5 check. And now, after king a5, knight c4 checkmate. Believe it or not. Quite gorgeous, isn't it? Or, even more beautiful, after king takes pawn, the 2 knights give a beautiful checkmate. Isn't chess a beautiful game? Well, with positions like this, I'm quite convinced it is. Thank you for listening, and until next week. Bye-bye.